The rain fell like a gentle accusation that January afternoon, each drop a quiet witness to my solitude. I stood before Richard's casket at Riverside Cemetery, clutching a single white rose so tightly the thorns had begun to pierce my palm. I didn't feel the pain. I couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight of emptiness. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old. And today I buried my husband of 42 years completely alone. Behind me, 3 folding chairs sat in the front row, empty, waiting for children who would never come. We are gathered here today, the priest began, his voice competing with the whisper of rain, to celebrate the life of Richard James Carter. I stopped listening. My eyes fixed on those empty chairs, each one a monument to absence. Melissa's chair, Ethan's chair, Sophie's chair. I'd asked the funeral director to set them up anyway, some desperate part of me hoping they might appear at the last moment. That I'd see Melissa's silhouette rushing through the cemetery gates, breathless with apologies. That Ethan's black Mercedes would pull up with screeching tires. That Sophie would emerge from behind a tree where she'd been hiding, overcome with grief. But there was only Mrs. Patterson from next door, her husband Harold supporting her frail frame, and old Mr. Chen from Richard's Thursday Chess Club. 3 people who barely knew my husband. 3 people who cared more about a man they'd known for mere years than the children he'd raised for decades. Evelyn. Mrs. Patterson touched my shoulder gently. "It's time, dear." I blinked, realizing the service had ended. I hadn't heard a word. The priest smiled sympathetically, probably assuming I was lost in grief. He didn't know I was lost in something far worse, the sudden brutal understanding that I had become invisible. When had it happened? When had I stopped being a person and become merely background noise in my own children's lives? I placed the white rose on Richard's casket, my hand leaving a small smudge of blood on the polished wood. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Sorry that only I was here. Sorry that our children had forgotten us. Sorry that he died knowing they wouldn't come. As the workers began lowering the casket, I remembered something. 6 months ago, my 68th birthday. I'd woken up that morning with foolish hope, checking my phone every few minutes. Surely this year they'd remember. Surely this year would be different. By noon, I'd stopped checking. That evening, Richard came home carrying a small store-bought cake from the supermarket, the kind with generic white frosting and "Happy Birthday" written in blue gel. He'd lit the candles himself, 68 of them crowding the tiny cake, and sung to me alone in our kitchen. "They're busy, honey," he'd said, his eyes unable to meet mine. "You know how it is." But I'd seen the invitation on the mail table. Thick, expensive cardstock. Melissa's birthday party the same day as mine at some exclusive venue in the Hamptons. 200 guests. I wasn't on the list. That was when I'd realized it. I'd become invisible even to my own children. Now, driving home from Richard's funeral in our old sedan, I passed through neighborhoods where lights glowed warm in windows, where families gathered for dinner, where people existed in each other's lives. Our house, too big now, too quiet, waited for me like an empty stage after the audience has left. Inside, I walked through rooms filled with ghosts. The living room where Melissa took her first steps, the kitchen where Ethan used to do homework while I cooked dinner, the den where Sophie and I would read together, her small head resting against my shoulder. On the walls, photographs chronicled a history that felt like fiction. 5-year-old Melissa hugging me, her face pressed against my neck in pure joy. 8-year-old Ethan grinning with his baseball trophy, my arms around his shoulders. 3-year-old Sophie asleep in my lap, her tiny hand clutching my finger. Where had those children gone? When had they been replaced by strangers who sent brief text messages and made promises they never kept? I sank onto the couch. Richard's indent still visible in the cushion beside me, and let myself cry. Not the dignified tears of a funeral, but deep, gasping sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for Richard. I cried for the mother I used to be. I cried for the woman I'd become, someone so forgettable that even her own children didn't notice her disappearance. At 11:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. 3 text messages within 2 minutes. Melissa. Mom, did Dad leave a will? Ethan. Need to discuss Dad's estate. Call me. Sophie. Mom, what happens to the house? We should talk about arrangements. I stared at the messages, a cold numbness replacing the tears. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I love you. Not, how are you holding up? Just questions about money. Richard had been right about them. And the realization broke something inside me that I didn't know could still break. I turned off my phone and sat in darkness, understanding for the first time that grief isn't just about losing someone you love. It's about discovering you've already been lost for years and nobody noticed you were gone. I woke up on the couch at dawn, my neck stiff and my face swollen from crying. For a moment, I forgot. Then reality crashed back. Richard was gone, and I was alone in a way that went beyond death. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. I ignored them all and made coffee with shaking hands. The kitchen felt enormous without Richard humming tunelessly at the stove, without his terrible jokes, without his presence filling the space. At 8:15 a.m., I decided to call my children, not because I expected comfort, but because I needed to hear their voices. Some foolish, desperate part of me hoped that maybe the text messages were just shock, that maybe in daylight they'd remember they had a mother who'd just lost her husband of 42 years. I called Melissa first. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. In the background, I heard music, the kind of pulsing EDM that played at expensive parties, and laughter, and the clink of champagne glasses. Mom! Melissa's voice was sharp with irritation. I'm at a charity gala in the Hamptons right now. This really isn't a good time. Your father just died, I said quietly. I know, Mom. I got your texts. Look, I'm so sorry I couldn't make it to the funeral. My flight from California got canceled. And then there was this thing with the foundation board meeting and… She paused. Someone in the background called her name. I really have to go. I'll call you back later, okay? We'll talk about everything. The house, Dad's accounts all of it. Melissa, I don't want to talk about… Mom, I promise I'll call you back. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, hearing her words echo. We'll talk about the house, Dad's accounts, all of it. Not, are you okay? Not, I'm so sorry for your loss. Not, I should have been there. I waited 30 seconds, then called Ethan. A woman answered. Professional, polite, emotionless. Carter and Associates, this is Jennifer speaking. How may I help you? This is Ethan's mother. I need to speak with him. It's about his father. I'm sorry Mr. Carter is in an important meeting with international clients. May I take a message? My voice cracked. Please. It's urgent. His father passed away. The funeral was yesterday. A pause. Then in the same pleasant, trained tone. I'll let him know you called. Is there anything else I can help you with today? No, I whispered. Thank you. 3 days passed. Ethan didn't call back. Instead, I received an email at 11:47 p.m. on the 3rd night. Mom heard about Dad. Very sorry. Traveling for work the next 2 weeks. We'll be in touch when I'm back. In the meantime, don't make any major decisions about the estate without consulting me. We need to handle this properly. E. No phone call. No, I love you. No acknowledgement that I'd just spent 72 hours alone in a house that felt like a mausoleum. Sophie was my last hope. My youngest, my baby. The one who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms, even when she was 12 years old. Surely Sophie would call. Surely Sophie still cared. I dialed her number. 2 rings, then voicemail. Her cheerful recorded voice. "Hey, you've reached Sophie. Can't talk right now, but leave a message, and I'll totally call you back." I tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. I left a message, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sophie, sweetheart, it's Mom. Your dad. He's gone, honey. The funeral was yesterday. I really need you right now. Please call me back. I love you." Silence. I called 4 more times over the next 2 days. All went to voicemail. Finally, on the 5th day, a text message arrived. "Sorry, Mom. Can't deal with this right now. Work is crazy. Will call when I can. Can't deal with this." As if her father's death was an inconvenient scheduling conflict. As if my grief was a burden she didn't have time to carry. That night I sat in Richard's study, a room I'd avoided since his death because it still smelled like him, like coffee and old books, and the sandalwood soap he used, and I noticed his desk drawer was slightly open. I'd never gone through his things without permission. It felt like a violation. But he was gone, and I was searching for something, anything that might make sense of this nightmare. Inside the drawer, beneath folders of financial documents and old tax returns, I found a leather journal. My hands trembled as I opened it. Richard's handwriting, careful, precise, filled the pages. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like observations, notes, records. June 15th. Called Melissa to invite her to Evelyn's birthday dinner. She said she'd try to make it. She didn't come. Didn't call to explain. July 3rd. Ethan canceled our monthly lunch. 3rd time in a row. Said he'd reschedule. He didn't. August 20th. Sophie's birthday. We sent a gift. She texted thanks but didn't call. Haven't heard her voice in 4 months. September 12th. Invited all 3 for Thanksgiving. All 3 said yes. None showed up. Page after page of careful documentation. Years of absences, cancellations, forgotten promises. My husband had been tracking the slow dissolution of our family, like a scientist recording the stages of a terminal illness. The final entry was dated 1 week before his death, January 3rd. Tomorrow, I'm finalizing the will. Evelyn doesn't know yet what I've planned, but she'll understand. She always understood me better than they ever did. If they don't come to my funeral, and I know they won't, she'll be free. Plan C is ready. Thomas Harlan knows what to do. Below that, a phone number and a name, Thomas Harlan. Executor. I closed the journal, my heart pounding. What was Plan C? What had Richard done? But before I could process the questions, I heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, I saw a black sedan pull up. A man in a dark suit emerged carrying a leather briefcase. He walked to the door with the careful deliberation of someone carrying bad news, or in this case, perhaps news that would change everything. I answered the bell before he could ring it. "Mrs. Carter." His voice was gentle, his eyes kind but cautious. "My name is Thomas Harlan. I was your husband's attorney. I think we need to talk." Thomas Harlan sat in my living room, his briefcase balanced on his knees, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pity, anticipation. Something else entirely. "Mrs. Carter," he began. "I've been Richard's attorney for 20 years. He was one of the most thoughtful, meticulous clients I've ever had. What he's done, well, in 30 years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like it. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with red wax. This is Richard's last will and testament. He asked me to meet with you alone before anyone else knows about it. He was very specific about timing. My throat tightened. Before anyone else, you mean before the children? Especially before the children. Harlan's expression softened. Mrs. Carter, before I read this, I need you to understand something. Your husband loved you very much. Everything he did to protect you, even if it doesn't feel that way at first. He broke the seal and unfolded several pages of legal paper. Then he began to read. I, Richard James Carter, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I leave my entire estate, including all assets, properties, investments, and shares in Carter & Associates to the one person who still loved me when I was no longer here. I frowned, confused. Who did he mean? Harlan looked at me steadily. You, Mrs. Carter. You were the only one at his funeral. The words didn't register at first. Then slowly, impossibly. Me, but the children were not present at the funeral. According to the terms of the will, the entire estate, approximately $47 million in assets, plus 100% ownership of his company, goes to you, and only you. The room tilted. $47 million. The company. Everything. This can't be legal, I whispered. They'll contest it. They'll say he wasn't in his right mind, that I manipulated. They can try. Harlan's voice was calm, assured. Richard anticipated that, which is why we have medical records from his full cognitive evaluation 1 week before drafting. This will, 2 independent witnesses, and... He pulled out a tablet. A video. He pressed play. Richard appeared on screen, sitting in this very room, looking directly at the camera. His face was thinner than I remembered his eyes, tired, but his voice was strong and clear. I, Richard James Carter, am making this video to prevent future disputes. I am of sound mind and body. No one has influenced me. This is my choice alone. My breath caught. He was speaking directly to me across the barrier of death. My children have not visited me in 3 years. They did not come to my 70th birthday party. They will not come to my funeral. I know this because they've already shown me who they are. I leave everything to Evelyn because she is the only one who still loves me, not for what I can provide, but for who I am. She earned this inheritance through 42 years of devotion. My children earned nothing. The video ended. I sat in stunned silence. There's one condition, Harlan continued. A very specific one. Of course there was. Richard never did anything without careful consideration. You must not voluntarily disclose this inheritance to anyone for 90 days. Not to your children, not to friends, not to anyone. If you deliberately reveal it before the 90 days are up, the entire estate will transfer automatically to the Elder Dignity Foundation. Why? My voice sounded hollow, distant. Because, Harlan said gently, Richard wanted to see who would come back for love and who would come back for money. He called it the silence test. He handed me a small leather notebook. He asked you to write down everything that happens in these 90 days. Every call, every visit, every conversation. Not for the court, for you. So you can see clearly who they've become without the fog of a mother's love. I stared at the notebook, Richard's final gift to me. Not money, not security, but truth. Mrs. Carter, I need to be clear about the terms. If someone discovers the inheritance on their own, that's not your violation. But if you tell them even accidentally, even under pressure, you forfeit everything.
The 90-day clock started the day of the funeral. You have 87 days left. What if... I swallowed hard. What if they hire investigators? What if they find out anyway? Then they find out. But it can't come from you. He leaned forward. Richard believed they would show their true colors if they thought there was still money to inherit. He wanted you to observe them without interfering, to see what he'd seen for years.
I thought about the journal, about years of documented absences and broken promises. Richard had been watching them pull away, and he'd been powerless to stop it. So he'd done the only thing he could, created a test they didn't know they were taking. There's one more thing. Harlan stood, walked to my safe. How did he know the location and pointed to it? Richard left 3 sealed envelopes in there, one for each child. He left very specific instructions. Give these to Evelyn only when the time is right. She'll know when. I have copies secured in my office, but he wanted you to have the originals. What's in them? I don't know. He sealed them himself. Harlan gathered his papers. Mrs. Carter, your husband believed you're stronger than you think. He wanted you to see it too. These 90 days aren't about punishing your children. They're about freeing you from the burden of hoping they'll change on their own. After he left, I sat in the quiet house processing everything. $47 million, the company, the house, everything. But more than that, a choice. For the first time in 40 years, I had the power to choose what happened next. Not to respond to their needs, not to accommodate their schedules, not to disappear into the background of their busy lives. I opened the notebook to the first page and wrote Day 8. Richard left me everything. The children don't know. They texted asking about the will, but haven't called to ask how I'm doing. I don't know if I should feel powerful or sad. Maybe both. Then I heard the doorbell. Through the window, I saw Melissa standing on my porch, holding an enormous bouquet of white lilies. She was perfectly dressed in black, her makeup flawless, her expression arranged into what looked like grief. But I noticed her eyes scanning the house through the window, taking inventory. I took a deep breath, clutched the notebook to my chest, and opened the door. The test had begun. Melissa swept into the house like a theater actress making an entrance. The white lilies extended before her like an offering to appease an angry God. Mom. She pulled me into a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and desperation. I'm so sorry I couldn't make it to the funeral. The flight was delayed, then canceled completely, and by the time I got another one, it was too late. I feel terrible. I stood stiffly in her embrace, feeling the performance of it. The calculated pressure of her arms, the practiced tremor in her voice, the way she pulled back at exactly the right moment to look into my eyes with perfectly calibrated remorse. It's fine, Melissa, I said quietly. No, it's not fine. She moved past me into the living room, still holding the lilies like a shield. Where should I put these? They're from that boutique florist in Manhattan you always liked. I hadn't been to Manhattan in 5 years, and I'd certainly never mentioned a favorite florist. But I took the flowers anyway, noticing the price tag she'd forgotten to remove, $347. Let me get a vase, I murmured. While I was in the kitchen, I heard her moving through the house. Not the aimless wandering of grief, but something more purposeful. When I returned, she was examining the artwork on the walls, the furniture, the photographs, taking inventory. Mom, we need to talk about arrangements. She sat on the sofa, patting the cushion beside her. I know this is hard, but there are practical matters to handle. Did he leave any instructions? Any documents I should know about? Your father took care of everything, I said carefully. Yes, but estate planning is complicated. You're going to need help managing things. She pulled out her phone. I've already contacted my financial advisor. She specializes in widow estate management, and my lawyer can help navigate probate. Melissa, I interrupted gently. Why didn't you come to the funeral?" She blinked, thrown off her script. "I told you the flight was canceled. You were in California. There are dozens of flights from Los Angeles to New York every day. It was complicated. There was a foundation board meeting I couldn't miss. We were voting on next year's budget, and if I wasn't there, your father died. I know that." Her voice rose, then she caught herself softening. "Mom, don't you think I feel terrible about it? Don't you think I wish I could have been there? But life doesn't stop just because—" She trailed off, realizing what she was about to say. Just because someone dies. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and I glimpsed the screen before she could hide it. Detective Morris found Carter asset records. Estimated 47M plus in stocks, real estate company shares. Full report ready Friday. My heart froze. Melissa had hired a private investigator to track Richard's assets, while his body was still warm, while I was burying him alone. "Who was that?" I asked lightly. "Just work stuff." She put the phone away quickly. "Mom, I'm worried about you. This house is too big for you alone. Have you thought about downsizing, maybe a nice apartment in the city closer to me? We could help you sell—" "I'm not selling the house. Of course not right away. But eventually—" She leaned forward, taking my hands in hers. The gesture felt rehearsed. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of, that Dad's legacy is protected, that his wealth, I mean his wishes, are honored." There it was. The slip. His wealth. "I appreciate your concern," I said, pulling my hands away gently. "But I'm managing just fine." Melissa's expression flickered, frustration quickly masked. "Mom, you don't understand how complex these things are. Estate taxes, legal requirements, asset management. It's overwhelming, even for professionals. You can't handle this alone. Your father left very clear instructions. Everything is handled." "What instructions? What did he—" She stopped, composing herself. "I think we should all sit down together. You, me, Ethan, Sophie, as a family. Make decisions together about how to move forward." As a family. The words were bitter in my mouth. Where was this family at the funeral? Where was this family for the past 3 years? After Melissa finally left, disappointed, I could tell that I hadn't revealed anything useful. I opened Richard's notebook and wrote, "Day 10, Melissa came. She hired a private investigator to track R's assets, suggested selling the house needing professional help with the estate. Asked about instructions 3 times. Not once asked how I'm sleeping or eating. Not once said, 'I love you.' Hugged me for exactly 3.2 seconds. I counted. That evening my phone rang. Ethan. Mom. His voice was smooth, controlled. I just heard from Melissa that she visited. I should have been there. I'm sorry I haven't called. Work has been absolutely insane. I understand, I said, though I didn't. Listen, I'm flying back this weekend. I've cleared my schedule because this is important. We need to sit down and discuss Dad's affairs properly. I've arranged for my estate attorney to join us, Marcus Berkowitz. He's one of the best in Manhattan. Very experienced with high net worth estates. Ethan, that's not necessary. Mom, with all due respect, it absolutely is necessary. Do you know how many widows get taken advantage of by unscrupulous financial advisors? It happens all the time. I'm not going to let that happen to you. Your father left clear instructions. What instructions? The smooth tone cracked slightly. Was there a will? Did he name an executor? Are there trusts, foundations, LLCs? We need to know what we're working with here. We, I asked quietly. Pause. Then more carefully. You, what you're working with. Obviously, this is your estate. I just want to help you understand your options. Make sure you're making informed decisions. That's thoughtful of you. Of course. You're my mother. I love you. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, like he was speaking a language he'd forgotten. Look, I'll email you the details for this weekend. Berkowitz can meet us at his office, very discreet, very professional. We'll get everything sorted out. After we hung up, I received an email within minutes, Saturday, 6 p.m. Berkowitz & Associates, 432 Park Avenue, 28th floor. Please bring any documentation related to Dad's estate, wills, trusts, account statements, property deeds, etc. Important that we have a complete picture. See you then. E. I didn't respond. The next morning, a delivery arrived, a large box from Tiffany & Company. Inside, nestled in signature blue packaging, was a diamond tennis bracelet with a card, "For the best mom in the world. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. I love you, Sophie." The bracelet was beautiful, delicate, expensive. At least $15,000, I guessed. I remembered Sophie's last visit 3 Thanksgivings ago, when she'd made a cutting remark about my outdated jewelry being an embarrassment at restaurants. Now she sent diamonds, but not herself. I added it all to the notebook at day 11. Ethan called arranged meeting with his attorney for Saturday to discuss the estate. Emailed immediately after with detailed instructions asking me to bring all financial documents. Sophie sent a $15K bracelet but hasn't called. Still hasn't called. None of them have asked how I'm sleeping. None have asked if I'm eating. All have asked about money. Richard was right. He was right about everything. That night, I opened the safe and looked at the 3 sealed envelopes. One for Melissa, one for Ethan, one for Sophie. I wondered what Richard had written to them, what final words he'd crafted for children who couldn't be bothered to hear his last living words. I didn't open them. Not yet. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the hurt and anger, a small foolish part of me still hoped. Hoped that one of them might surprise me, might prove Richard wrong, might remember they had a mother who was grieving and alone. But with each passing day, that hope grew smaller, and the notebook grew fuller. Saturday arrived cold and gray, the kind of January morning that makes you question whether spring will ever come again. I dressed carefully, not in morning black, but in the navy suit Richard always said made me look strong. I needed that strength today. The Uber dropped me at 432 Park Avenue, one of those glass towers that seemed designed to intimidate. In the gleaming lobby, security directed me to the 28th floor. Berkowitz & Associates occupied the entire level, all marble and dark wood, and the quiet hum of serious money. A receptionist led me to a conference room where Ethan waited with 2 other men, one in his 60s, silver-haired and shark-eyed Marcus Berkowitz, presumably, and a younger man with a laptop and the expressionless face of someone paid to have no opinions, the accountant, I guessed. "Mom." Ethan stood, kissed my cheek. The gesture felt like a business handshake. "Thank you for coming. This is Marcus Berkowitz, my attorney, and David Chen, financial analyst. They're here to help us navigate the complexities ahead." "Mrs. Carter." Berkowitz extended his hand. His grip was firm, his smile practiced. "Please sit. We know this must be a difficult time, and we want to make this process as smooth as possible for you." They'd arranged the seating, so I faced all 3 of them across the vast conference table like a defendant at trial. But before I sat, I did something Richard had taught me in his journal. Something I'd never have had the courage to do before. I reached into my purse and activated the voice recorder on my phone, positioning it carefully so the microphone pointed toward them. Richard's journal entry from 3 weeks before his death. "If they try to manipulate you, record everything. The truth sounds different when you hear it later. Don't tell them you're recording New York is a one-party consent state. It's legal, do it." "So, Mom," Ethan began once I'd sat, "why don't you tell us what Dad left behind? Any documentation before we discuss that, I said carefully. Can I ask you something? Ethan exchanged glances with Berkowitz. Of course. Why didn't you come to your father's funeral? The room temperature seemed to drop. Berkowitz cleared his throat. Chen suddenly became very interested in his laptop. Mom, we've been over this. I don't think we have. Not really. You said you'd call. You didn't. So I'm asking now what was more important than saying goodbye to your father. Ethan's jaw tightened. I had a closing, a major deal I'd been working on for 8 months, $5 million. If I wasn't there to sign, we'd lose everything. And you couldn't postpone it even by a day. No. His voice was sharp now, the corporate executive breaking through. The investors were flying back to Singapore. It was that day or never. So you chose the money. I chose my career, my future, He stopped realizing how it sounded. Look, Dad was already gone. My being at a funeral wasn't going to change that. He would have understood. He was a businessman himself. He always said business comes first. The words hung in the air, ugly and true. Berkowitz jumped in smooth as oil. Mrs. Carter, I think what Ethan means is that grief manifests differently for everyone. Some people process loss through action, through focusing on work and responsibilities. He said his father would understand, I interrupted quietly. But he doesn't know what his father understood, because he wasn't there. Another uncomfortable silence. Then Berkowitz shifted tactics, pulling out a folder. Well, let's focus on why we're here. Estate planning. Mrs. Carter, at your age, no offense intended, managing large assets can be overwhelming. Many widows find themselves vulnerable to poor advice, bad investments, scam artists. I'm 68, not senile. Of course not. But the reality is complex estates require professional management, which is why we've prepared a proposal. He slid a document across the table. A comprehensive trust structure. Ethan would serve as trustee with full management authority over assets. You would receive a generous monthly allowance. We suggest $15,000, which should more than cover your needs. No stress, no worries, no complicated decisions. I looked at the document without touching it. $15,000. Monthly, Chen added helpfully. That's $180,000 per year, quite comfortable. And the rest of the estate would be professionally managed for maximum growth and security, Berkowitz continued. Ethan has extensive experience in asset management. This structure protects you from making any unwise decisions. Cognitive decline is a natural part of aging, and this safeguards against that. They were calling me incompetent. Politely, professionally, but unmistakably. What if I don't agree to this? I asked. Berkowitz's smile never wavered. Then we'd have to explore other options, potentially including a guardianship evaluation if family members are concerned about your capacity to manage affairs independently. The threat was clear sign over control, or they'd try to have me declared mentally incompetent. I see, I said quietly. Then I stood. Thank you for your time, Mr. Berkowitz, but I won't be needing your services. Mom. Ethan stood too, frustration breaking through. You're making a mistake. You don't understand how complicated this is. Dad's company alone is worth millions, and if you mismanage it, your father left clear instructions. I intend to follow them. What instructions? His voice rose. Show me the will. Show me what he actually said, because I find it very hard to believe he'd leave you to handle everything alone without you controlling it. His face flushed red. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? It's about protecting what Dad built. It's about making sure his legacy isn't squandered by someone who doesn't understand finance or business, or he stopped, but the words hung there anyway, or by you. I gathered my purse. I'll be going now. Mrs. Carter. Berkowitz tried one more time. Perhaps you should consult with your own attorney before making any hasty, "I already have an attorney. Thank you." In the elevator, my hands shook so badly I could barely press the lobby button. But I'd done it. I'd stood up to them. I'd said no, and I had it all on tape. That evening, I listened to the recording 3 times, Richard's words echoing in my mind. The truth sounds different when you hear it later. Ethan's voice cold and clear. Dad was already gone. My being there wouldn't change anything. He would have understood business comes first. I added it to the notebook day 16. Ethan tried to force me to sign over control of the estate. Threatened guardianship proceedings if I refused. Said Dad's funeral wouldn't change anything because business comes first. Claimed Dad would understand choosing a 5M deal over saying goodbye. I have it all recorded. Richard was right. Give them rope, they'll hang themselves. But the victory felt hollow. Because the son I'd raised, the boy who used to make me breakfast in bed on Mother's Day with runny eggs and burnt toast, was gone. Replaced by this stranger who valued money over memory. I went to Richard's study, opened the safe, and looked at the 3 envelopes again. Not yet, I told myself. Give them time. Maybe they'll surprise you. But I was starting to understand what Richard had known all along: people don't surprise you. They reveal themselves if you pay attention. And I was paying attention now. The rest of January passed in a strange fog of watchfulness. I became an anthropologist, studying my own family, documenting their behaviors like someone observing an exotic species that had once been familiar. Melissa called 3 more times each conversation, following the same patterned surface-level concern. Rapid pivot to financial questions, frustration. When I revealed nothing, insistence that I was making things unnecessarily difficult. Ethan sent a series of increasingly curt emails, each one implying that my stubbornness was irresponsible, that I was risking everything Dad had built, that I needed to face reality about my limitations. Sophie remained silent, except for one more expensive gift, a cashmere scarf from Bergdorf Goodman, with a card reading, "Thinking of you." Not thinking hard enough to actually call, apparently. The notebook filled with observations that all pointed to the same devastating conclusion. Richard had been right. They cared about the money. They didn't care about me. On February 1st, exactly 4 weeks after Richard's death, I woke at 3 a.m. from a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. I found myself walking through the dark house, ending up in Richard's study, drawn there by some instinct I didn't understand. I turned on the desk lamp and pulled out his journal again, reading through entries I'd skipped the first time March 8th. Evelyn hasn't painted in 6 months. She used to spend hours with watercolors lost in her art. Now she just exists. The children did this to her. They took so much she forgot what she wanted. June 22nd. Watched he cook dinner alone tonight. She was crying. When I asked why, she said she wasn't crying. But I know my wife, she's becoming invisible even to herself. I'd forgotten I used to paint. How was that possible? It had been my greatest joy once my escape, my voice. When had I stopped? When had I become just mom? And then eventually, not even that. I opened the desk drawer again, the one where I'd found the journal. This time I pulled everything out. Old tax returns, business documents, receipts. At the very back, behind a false panel, I'd never noticed there was something else. An envelope. Thick cream-colored, sealed with red wax. My name written on it in Richard's careful handwriting. For my invisible wife. When you're ready to see. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside 3 pages, covered in Richard's handwriting. Not the rushed scrawl of his journals, but careful, deliberate letters. This had taken time. Evelyn, my invisible wife. If you're reading this, you know the truth about our children. You've watched them for weeks now, maybe longer. You've seen what I saw for years, but could never make you believe they stopped seeing you a long time ago. I've watched you disappear over the years. Not physically, you were always there. Always cooking dinner no one came home to eat. Always buying birthday presents they'd forget to open. Always making yourself smaller and quieter, and less hoping that if you needed less, they'd have more to give. But that's not how it works, my love. The less you asked for, the less they offered. Your invisibility didn't make them notice you. It made them forget you existed at all. I gave them everything. The best schools, every opportunity, a comfortable life. You gave them even more: your time, your dreams, your entire identity. You stopped being Evelyn Marie Thompson, the woman who wanted to be an artist who loved Monet and danced in the rain and laughed so hard she snorted. You became Mom, and then not even that. You became the woman they called when they needed something. Do you remember the last time you painted I Do? It was 6 years ago. You were working on a watercolor of the garden. Melissa called in the middle, some crisis with her foundation board needed advice immediately. You dropped everything. When you came back an hour later, you looked at the half-finished painting and said, "I don't remember what I was trying to create." You never picked up a brush again. That's when I knew I was losing you. Not to death, but to this slow erasure. You were disappearing into their needs, and they didn't even notice. I had to stop reading, my vision blurred with tears. I didn't remember that phone call or that painting, but I believed it. I believed all of it. This inheritance isn't really about money, Evelyn. It's about giving you a choice. Maybe the first real choice you've had in 40 years. You could choose to forgive them, to give them everything, despite how they've treated you, to hope they'll change. That would be easy. It's what you've always done. Or you could choose yourself. Choose to be visible again. Choose to remember who you were before you became invisible. These 90 days are your time. Watch them. Listen to them. See if any of them come for love instead of money. See if any of them ask how you're doing instead of what you have. I predict they won't. I've watched them too long. They're too far gone down the road of entitlement. But I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. For your sake and theirs. At the end of 90 days, you'll know the truth. And then you choose forgive without change or demand accountability. Share the inheritance with people who don't deserve it or use it to become visible again. Either way, the choice is yours. Not theirs, not mine, yours. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this pain while I was alive. I was weak too. I wanted to believe they'd change, that they'd remember what matters. But denial is its own kind of cowardice. So this is my final gift to you: truth. Painful, ugly, undeniable truth. And the power to choose what to do with it. The letter continued. In the safe behind our wedding photo, there are 3 envelopes. One for each child. They're letters I wrote saying things I should have said when I was alive but didn't have the courage. Open them only if they prove they've changed. Only if they come back for the right reasons. You'll know when the time is right, my love. You always knew me better than anyone. These letters are their last chance at redemption. But Evelyn, they don't deserve them unless they earn them. Don't give grace cheaply. I learned that lesson too late. Don't make my mistake. The final paragraph broke me. You were never invisible to me, Evelyn. Not for one single day of our 42 years together. You were the only real thing in my life. Everything else, the company, the money, the success, meant nothing compared to you. I'm sorry I let them make you disappear. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to keep you visible. This is my way of bringing you back, of making you see yourself the way I always saw you, as the strongest, kindest, most remarkable person I've ever known. I love you. I always did. I always will. Be visible again, my love. Paint something beautiful. Richard. I don't know how long I sat there crying, clutching the letter like it was Richard himself. The grief I'd been holding at bay for weeks crashed over me in waves, not just grief for his death, but for all the years of slowly losing myself, for all the moments I'd disappeared and nobody noticed, for the woman I used to be who'd been erased so gradually I hadn't seen it happening. When the tears finally stopped, I walked to the safe with new determination. I moved aside our wedding photo, young faces full of hope, and found 3 white envelopes exactly where Richard said they'd be, each one labeled in his handwriting, for Melissa, if she returns, for Ethan, if he remembers, for Sophie, if she still has a heart. I held them but didn't open them. These weren't for me. These were for them if they ever earned the right to read them. I placed them back in the safe, but I kept Richard's letter to me. I would read it every day. I would use it to remember who I was before I became invisible. I opened the notebook and wrote, Day 28. Found Richard's letter. He saw everything. He knew I'd disappeared. He spent our last weeks trying to make me visible again. The children have 62 days left. I don't think they'll pass the test. But I'm going to give them the chance anyway, not because they deserve it, because I deserve to know the truth without doubt. Then I did something I hadn't done in 6 years. I went to the hall closet, dug past winter coats and old shoes, and found my art supplies. Dusty, forgotten, but still there, waiting for me to remember they existed. I set up an easel in the kitchen as the sun rose. I didn't know what I was going to paint yet, but I knew I needed to start, to become visible again, even if only to myself. The painting was terrible. 6 years away from brushes and canvas left my hands clumsy, my eye uncertain. The watercolor of our garden looked like something a child might make all muddy colors and wrong proportions. But it existed. I had created something. And that felt like resurrection. I was touching up the sky when my phone exploded with notifications. 15 texts in 30 seconds, then calls, then more texts. Melissa, Mom, call me right now, Ethan. What the hell is going on? Sophie, Mom, are you okay? I put down my brush and checked the news. The headline hit me like a physical blow. Tech mogul Richard Carter's 47-7 estate, mysterious heir revealed. My hands shook as I read. An anonymous source described as a former Carter and Associates employee had leaked partial estate documents to a financial news blog. The article was vague on specifics, but clear on the explosive part. Richard Carter had left a fortune to an unnamed beneficiary in a will with unusual conditions. The comments section was already on fire with speculation. Secret mistress, illegitimate child, probably a cult or some weird charity. Where's the wife in all this? Within an hour, major news outlets picked up the story. By noon, reporters were parked outside my house, ringing the doorbell, shouting questions through the mail slot. Mrs. Carter, do you know who inherited your husband's estate? Is it true you were written out of the will? Do you have any comment on the mystery beneficiary? I closed the curtains and didn't answer. Thomas Harlan had been clear, say nothing. Just 15 more days until the 90-day period ended. I could stay silent for 15 more days, but my children couldn't. Melissa called 17 times before I finally answered. Mom! Her voice was high-panicked. Have you seen the news? Everyone's talking about Dad's will. They're saying he left his money to someone else. Do you know what's going on? I can't discuss it, I said carefully. What do you mean you can't discuss it? This is about our family, about Dad's legacy. Mom, If someone manipulated him, if there's fraud involved, we need to act immediately. My lawyer says, Melissa. My voice was firmer than I'd ever used with her. I said I can't discuss it. Why not? Unless… Her tone changed, became suspicious. Do you know who it is? Did Dad tell you something, Mom, if you're protecting someone? I hung up. Ethan was at my door within 2 hours, pounding hard enough to rattle the frame. Mom, I know you're in there. We need to talk. Now. I opened the door a crack. His face was red, his tie loosened, his usually perfect hair disheveled. Ethan, this isn't a good time. Not a good time. He pushed past me into the house. Mom, the news is saying Dad left his fortune to some mystery person. Do you understand what this means? If there's a competing claim, if someone defrauded him, we need to act fast. I've already called Berkowitz. We can file a contest petition by tomorrow if we move quickly. I don't think that's necessary. You don't think… He stared at me like I'd spoken in another language. Mom, are you hearing yourself? Someone is trying to steal Dad's estate, our inheritance, everything he built. Your inheritance? I kept my voice level. Were you named in the will? Well, no, I haven't seen it yet, but obviously Dad would have provided for his children. It's standard. Unless someone manipulated him at the end when he was weak. Your father wasn't weak. He was very clear-minded until his last day. How would you know you're not a doctor? And there are legal standards for testamentary capacity that… He stopped studying my face. You know something. What do you know? I know your father loved me. I met his eyes. And I know he made his choices very carefully. What's that supposed to mean? I didn't answer. That evening, all 3 children showed up together, clearly having coordinated. Melissa, Ethan, and Sophie stood on my doorstep, like a delegation coming to negotiate terms. Mom, Melissa said, her voice carefully controlled. We think you're in shock. The trauma of losing Dad combined with media attention has you confused. We understand. But we need to know what Dad told you, what you know about the will. We're not accusing you of anything, Ethan added quickly. We just want to understand what's happening, as a family. As a family. The words were bitter. Sophie at least looked uncomfortable. Mom, are you okay? You seem… different. I'm fine, I said. Better than I've been in years, actually. That's not normal, Melissa insisted. Grief doesn't make people better. Mom, we're worried about you. Maybe you should see someone, a therapist, just to make sure you're processing everything healthily. Are you suggesting I'm mentally unstable? No, but her eyes said otherwise. We're suggesting you're under tremendous stress and maybe not thinking clearly, which is why we should handle the legal matters. Let us protect you. From what? From whoever is trying to steal Dad's money. What if… I said quietly, the person inheriting has every right to do so. The 3 of them froze. What do you mean? Ethan's voice was sharp. I mean, your father knew exactly what he was doing. Mom. Melissa stepped forward. Do you know who inherited? Have you seen the will? I looked at my 3 children, these strangers wearing familiar faces, and made a decision. I can't discuss it for another 15 days. If you want answers, you'll have to wait. 15 days? Ethan's eyes narrowed. That's very specific. Why 15 days? Those are the terms. Terms of what? Melissa demanded. Mom, what aren't you telling us? Nothing you deserve to know, I said, and closed the door. I heard them arguing outside. Melissa insisting they should contest the will immediately. Ethan wanting to hire investigators. Sophie saying maybe they should just wait like Mom asked. Wait! Melissa's voice was shrill. While some stranger runs off with our inheritance, are you insane? It's not our inheritance, Sophie said quietly. It was Dad's. He could do whatever he wanted with it. That's not how families work, Ethan snapped. We're his children. We're entitled. I stopped listening, went back to my painting, added another layer to the sky. 3 days later, Melissa and Ethan filed a formal petition to contest the will. The grounds: undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, and potential fraud. They hired a team of lawyers, demanded the will be examined, requested Richard's medical records, insisted on deposing anyone who'd had contact with him in his final weeks. Sophie didn't join the petition. Instead, she sent me a text. "Mom, I don't want to fight you. I don't care about the money. I just want to understand. Can we talk? Just us?" But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until the 90 days were up. I added it all to the notebook. Day 75. The news leaked. Melissa and Ethan filed a contest petition within 72 hours. They've hired multiple lawyers talking about our inheritance like it's already theirs. Sophie is the only one who seems conflicted. The only one who asked if I'm okay instead of demanding answers. Maybe there's hope for her. Maybe. 15 more days. Then they would know. Then everyone would know. And I was ready for what came next. The 91st day arrived on a cold March morning. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers who'd followed the story like a soap opera. The Carter estate mystery had become a minor media sensation: a rich dead man, a silent widow, and a will that might rewrite everything. Inside courtroom 4B, I sat on one side with Thomas Harlan. On the other side, Melissa and Ethan, flanked by a small army of attorneys, led by Marcus Berkowitz. Sophie sat in the gallery, not with her siblings, but alone in the back row. Our eyes met briefly. Hers said, "I'm sorry." Mine said, "I know." Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with gray hair, pulled back severely, reviewed the petition with the expression of someone who'd seen too many family fights over money. "This is a petition to contest the will of Richard James Carter," she began, "on grounds of undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, and potential fraud." She looked over her reading glasses at Melissa and Ethan. "The petitioners are the decedent's children. Mrs. Carter, you're the widow. Do you have counsel? I do your honor." Harlan stood. "Thomas Harlan, representing Mrs. Evelyn Carter." Berkowitz rose smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may address the court. My clients have been kept in the dark about their father's estate for 3 months. The will has been hidden, its contents undisclosed. We believe there has been manipulation, possibly by parties who isolated Mr. Carter from his family in his final weeks." "Objection," Harlan said calmly. "Counsel is making accusations without evidence." "Then let's see evidence," Berkowitz shot back. "We request full disclosure of the will's contents and the identity of the beneficiary. The family has a right to know." Judge Morrison turned to Harlan. "Mr. Harlan, are you prepared to disclose the will's contents?" "I am, Your Honor. The 90-day confidentiality period ended yesterday." 90-day what?" Berkowitz looked confused. "It was a condition of the will," Harlan explained. "Mrs. Carter was required to keep the inheritance confidential for 90 days. As of yesterday, she's free to discuss it." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, I'm going to ask you directly, do you know who inherited your husband's estate?" The courtroom fell silent. Reporters leaned forward. Melissa gripped the table. Ethan's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. I stood slowly, my legs steadier than I expected. "I do, Your Honor." "And who is that?" I looked directly at my children. "Me. I inherited everything because I was the only one who came to his funeral." The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted. Cameras flashed. Berkowitz started objecting loudly. Melissa's face went white, then red, then white again. Ethan looked like he'd been physically struck. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. "Order, order in this court." When the noise finally died down, she looked at me with something like pity. "Mrs. Carter, are you stating that you are the sole beneficiary of your husband's estate?" "Yes, Your Honor. According to Richard's will, the entire estate, approximately $47 million in assets plus full ownership of Carter and Associates, goes to the one person who still loved him. I was the only one who attended his funeral. Therefore, I inherited everything." "This is outrageous." Berkowitz was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is clearly a case of undue influence. Mrs. Carter obviously manipulated." "I have evidence that will address all concerns," Harlan interrupted, "if the court will permit." Judge Morrison nodded. "Proceed." Harlan opened his briefcase with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. First, medical records. Richard Carter underwent a comprehensive cognitive evaluation by Dr. Patricia Chen, board-certified psychiatrist, 1 week before drafting this will. He submitted the documents. Dr. Chen found him to be of completely sound mind with no signs of diminished capacity. Second, independent witnesses. The will was witnessed by myself and 2 paralegals with no connection to Mrs. Carter or the estate. All 3 of us will testify to Mr. Carter's clear intentions and complete mental lucidity. Third, Harlan pulled out a tablet. Mr. Carter recorded a video statement explaining his decision. With the court's permission, I'd like to play it now. The judge nodded. The lights dimmed. On the screen mounted on the wall, Richard appeared sitting in his study, our study looking directly at the camera. He looked tired, older than I remembered, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady. "I, Richard James Carter, am making this video to prevent future disputes. I am 70 years old, of sound mind and body. No one has influenced me. This is my choice alone, made freely and with full understanding of its implications." I clutched the armrest of my chair. Hearing his voice again was like being stabbed and healed simultaneously. "My children have not visited me in 3 years. They did not come to my 70th birthday party despite promising they would. They did not come to Thanksgiving, Christmas, or any family gathering. They call when they need something. They text when they remember. They have become strangers who happen to share my DNA." Melissa was crying now, but silently, her hand over her mouth. "They will not come to my funeral. I know this with absolute certainty because I've watched them for years and I know who they've become. They love success status money. They don't love me. And they stopped loving their mother a long time ago. I leave everything to Evelyn because she is the only one who still sees me. Not the company founder, not the wealthy businessman, not the useful ATM machine. Just me, Richard, the man who burns toast and tells bad jokes and still cries during sad movies. She earned this inheritance through 42 years of showing up, of being present, of loving me when I was nobody and continuing to love me when I became somebody. She deserves it. They don't. If my children are watching this in a courtroom trying to take what isn't theirs, I want them to know I see you. I've always seen you. And I'm deeply disappointed in who you chose to become." The video ended. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Morrison removed her glasses and pressed her fingers to her temples. Several jurors in the gallery were crying. Even the bailiff looked shaken. "Mr. Harlan," the judge said quietly, "do you have anything else?" "One more thing, Your Honor." He pulled out his phone. "This is an audio recording from a meeting Mrs. Carter attended with the petitioner Ethan Carter and his attorney recorded legally in New York, a one-party consent state." He played it. Ethan's voice filled the courtroom. "Dad was already gone. My being there wouldn't have changed anything. He would have understood business comes first." Ethan closed his eyes, his face crumpling. Then Berkowitz's voice. "At your age, cognitive decline is a real concern. This structure protects you from making any unwise decisions." The implications were clear. They'd tried to declare me incompetent to seize control of assets they thought they'd inherit. Judge Morrison's expression had gone from neutral to openly disgusted. Mr. Berkowitz, does your client have any evidence to support the petition? Any evidence at all of undue influence, fraud, or lack of capacity? Berkowitz shuffled papers helplessly. Your Honor, the circumstantial evidence suggests your clients ignored their father for years and now want his money. The judge's voice was ice. I've been on this bench for 23 years. I've seen many family disputes, but rarely have I seen such a clear case of children valuing dollars over their own father. She looked directly at Melissa and Ethan. Your father's will is crystal clear. His mental capacity is unquestionable. His reasons are documented extensively. And frankly, his judgment of your character appears to be accurate. Bang. The gavel came down. The will of Richard James Carter is valid and shall stand. Mrs. Evelyn Carter is the sole beneficiary of the estate. Petition dismissed. Then she added, not part of the official record, but from somewhere deep and human. And may I say, your father gave you every advantage in life. He deserved better than this. This court is adjourned. Melissa collapsed into her chair, sobbing openly now. Ethan sat frozen, staring at nothing. Their lawyers gathered papers and left quickly, embarrassed by association. Sophie ran from the gallery crying. I stood, thanked Harlan quietly, and walked out of the courtroom. The reporters surged forward with questions, but I pushed through them without speaking. Behind me, I heard Melissa's voice, desperate and shrill. Mom, please, we need to talk. But I kept walking. I had won. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something that should never have had to end this way. Outside, the March sun was too bright. I put on Richard's old sunglasses, I'd been wearing them since he died, and got into the Uber I'd called. As we pulled away, I saw Melissa and Ethan standing on the courthouse steps, looking lost and small and utterly defeated. Good, a part of me thought. Let them feel what it's like to lose everything. But another part, the part that was still their mother, despite everything, whispered, it didn't have to be this way. The next morning, I woke to my face on the front page of the New York Times. Widow wins estate battle. I was the only one who came to his funeral. The article was mostly sympathetic, painting me as the abandoned wife who'd been vindicated. But the comment sections were vicious. She manipulated him. No way he'd cut out his own kids otherwise. Gold digger probably poisoned him, LOL. The kids are probably relieved. Who wants a mom that petty? But also good for her. Those kids sound like entitled brats. My mother was invisible to me too. This story is a wake-up call. 44/7 Melmers won't fix the hole where her family should be. Sad for everyone. I closed my laptop. They were right about one thing. $47 million couldn't fix what was broken. Money never could. Which is why that afternoon I asked Thomas Harlan to arrange a press conference. Are you sure? He asked carefully. You're under no obligation to make any public statements. I'm sure. The press conference was held on the steps of the Carter Foundation headquarters, a building Richard had funded, to support education initiatives, fitting, given what I was about to do. Cameras and reporters crowded the plaza. I stood at the podium, my statement written on index cards I didn't need. I'd memorized every word. My name is Evelyn Carter. I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. 3 months ago, I lost my husband of 42 years. Yesterday, a judge confirmed that he left me his entire estate. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. Today, I want to announce my decision about that inheritance. I took a breath. I'm donating every single dollar to establish the Richard Carter Home, a residential facility for elderly people who've been abandoned by their families. The crowd erupted with questions. I held up my hand. The home will provide housing, medical care activities, and most importantly, community for seniors who've become invisible to their own children, people who gave everything to their families and received nothing in return, people like me. A reporter shouted, "What about your children? How do they feel about this?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "They're here for my money, not for me. They made that clear. Mrs. Carter, why are you doing this?" I looked directly into the cameras. Because my husband taught me that the best revenge isn't punishment, it's transformation. He gave me $47 million, but what he really gave me was my voice back, my purpose, my visibility. Every dollar will go toward making sure no one else has to experience what I experienced, being erased by the people who should have seen you most clearly. I stepped away from the podium, ignoring the barrage of follow-up questions. Within hours, the story exploded across every media platform. Widow gives away $47 million inheritance to help invisible elderly. The ultimate revenge mother donates fortune kids tried to take. Carter home. Woman transforms personal pain into purpose. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from strangers wanting to support the home. Volunteers signed up. Architectural firms offered pro bono design services. It was as if I'd touched something universal everyone knew, someone who'd been forgotten or feared becoming invisible themselves. But my children's responses were different. Melissa called, her voice tight with fury. "You can't do this. That's our father's money. We could have done so much with it. Funded programs, built schools, created scholarships. You're being selfish and vindictive. Your father could have left it to you," I said quietly. "He chose not to. This is what he wanted." "No, it's what you want. You're doing this to hurt us." "If that were true, I'd have kept it all. Money can hurt more than absence, Melissa." She hung up. Ethan sent a long, brutal email. "I'll spare you most of it, but the core message was clear. I was senile, vindictive, wasting Dad's legacy, and he was consulting with lawyers about having me evaluated for competency. His lawyers must have told him he had no case because I never heard about it again." Sophie sent a text. "Mom, I think Dad would be proud of you. I think I understand now what you and he were trying to teach us. I'm sorry I learned too late." I stared at that message for a long time, wanting to respond, but not knowing what to say. That evening, Thomas Harlan came to the house. "Mrs. Carter, there's something you should know." He handed me a folder. "Before Richard died, he did something extraordinary. He sent emails to various people, Ethan's business partners, members of Melissa's foundation board. The emails were programmed to send only if you were sued over the estate." I opened the folder. Inside were printouts of emails Richard had written to Ethan's partners. "If you're reading this, my son has likely sued his mother after my death. I want you to know, Ethan chose a business meeting over my funeral. He told his mother that my death wouldn't change anything because business comes first. I ask you to consider what kind of man prioritizes a deal over his own father's goodbye, and whether that's someone you want representing your interests. To Melissa's board, if my daughter is fighting her mother for money after I'm gone, you should know Melissa didn't attend my funeral because she was at a party. She hired a private investigator to track my assets before I was buried. She built a career on charity while abandoning her own parents. I leave it to you to judge whether that aligns with your organization's values." "Richard protected you," Harlan said softly, "even after death. He knew they might attack, so he ensured there would be consequences." I traced my finger over Richard's words, feeling him still guiding me, still seeing me. "He really did know them," I whispered. "He knew you too," Harlan replied. "He knew you'd choose transformation over revenge. That's why he trusted you with everything." After he left, I sat in the quiet house soon to be sold, the proceeds going to the home, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not happiness. The hole where my family used to be still ached. but peace knowing I'd honored Richard's wishes and my own values. I opened my notebook to write, but this time, I wrote something different. Day 94. I chose transformation. Not because they deserved my mercy, but because I deserved my own redemption. Richard gave me power, and I chose to use it to help others instead of hurt the people who hurt me. I hope he's proud. I hope I'm becoming visible again, even to myself. That night, I pulled out my watercolors and started a new painting. Not the garden this time, but something else. A portrait of Richard smiling the way he used to when it was just us, before the world got complicated, before we had children who forgot to love us back. I was painting when my phone buzzed with a news alert: Melissa Carter resigns from Hope Foundation amid scandal. And beneath it, Ethan Carter's business partners drop major accounts. Richard's emails had done their work. The karma he'd engineered was coming home. 6 weeks after the trial, I was shopping for groceries when I saw Melissa on the cover of a magazine. Not a good cover. Not the kind she used to grace with her perfectly styled hair and practiced smile. This was a tabloid, and the headline read, "From Charity Queen to Cast Out Melissa Carter's Fall from Grace." I bought the magazine. I shouldn't have, but I did. The article detailed everything Melissa's firing, from Hope for Tomorrow, the mass exodus of donors, the public statements from board members, disappointed in her character. But it went further. Her husband David had filed for divorce. The grounds listed irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew what that meant. He'd married a philanthropist and discovered she'd let her own father die alone. Melissa had been forced to sell her house. She'd moved to a small apartment in Queens, far from the Manhattan social circles she'd once dominated. Her friends had vanished. Her phone calls went unreturned. Invitations dried up. She'd become invisible. The irony was almost poetic. Ethan's story was equally brutal, splashed across business publications. Carter's partners drop controversial CEO. Major clients flee after family scandal. Business ethics in question. Ethan Carter's downfall. The $5 million deal he'd chosen over Richard's funeral. It had collapsed when his Singapore investors read about the trial. They'd released a statement: "We value family and integrity in our business partners. Mr. Carter has demonstrated neither." Within a month, Ethan lost 3 more major clients. His company's board voted him out as CEO. The company he'd built, bearing his name, no longer wanted him. He'd burned through his savings fighting the will and paying lawyers. Now he was doing consulting work for a fraction of his former salary. I learned all this not because I was following them, but because their falls were public spectacles. The media loved it, the entitled rich kids who got their comeuppance. But I felt no satisfaction, just a dull, sad recognition that this was what Richard had predicted, what he'd planned for even. The emails he'd sent, the evidence he'd compiled. He'd known exactly what would happen if they tried to take what wasn't theirs. He'd given them rope, and they'd hanged themselves with it. Social media was particularly vicious. A hashtag emerged: #ChildrenWhoChoseMoney. People posted their own stories of family abandonment, of elderly parents, forgotten, of children who called only when they needed something. Melissa and Ethan became symbols of everything wrong with entitled generations. Someone created a TikTok video summarizing their story that got 40 million views. The comments were brutal. Imagine choosing a party over your own father's funeral. The $5 deal that cost him everything. Hope it was worth it. That judge's face when she dismissed the case lives in my head rent-free. They got exactly what they deserved. Melissa and Ethan couldn't show their faces in public without being recognized, photographed, shamed. Their lives became cautionary tales. Only Sophie seemed different. Sophie had quit her marketing job shortly after the trial. I didn't know this until I saw her Instagram post. She'd made her account public, perhaps as an act of transparency. I've spent the last month thinking about what my father said in that video. That he was disappointed in who we'd become. He was right. I'm ashamed of my siblings. But I'm more ashamed of myself for not being better. I'm taking time to figure out who I want to be, not who I am based on my job or my income, but who I am as a person. I failed my parents. I can't fix that. But maybe I can become someone they'd be proud of eventually. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad. I'll try to do better. And the post had thousands of comments, mostly supportive. People respected vulnerability more than they respected perfection. I wanted to reach out to her, but something held me back. Maybe pride, maybe hurt, maybe the fear that if I extended a hand, it would be slapped away. 3 months after the trial, on a cold December morning, I was shoveling snow from my driveway. I'd always hated hiring people for simple tasks, and now I needed the physical labor needed to feel useful and strong when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Melissa stood there, and I barely recognized her. No designer coat, just a Target parka. No perfectly styled hair, just gray roots showing and pulled back in a messy ponytail. No makeup covering the dark circles under her eyes. She looked human, fragile, broken. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking. "Can we talk? Please?" I leaned on the shovel, studying her. "What do you want, Melissa?" She started crying right there in the street. Not the pretty crying of someone who knows they're being watched, but ugly, gasping sobs. I lost everything. My job, my marriage, my friends. I have nothing left. And so you came here. I came because... She wiped her face with her sleeve, not even caring how she looked. Because I finally understand what I lost. And it wasn't Dad's money. I said nothing, waiting. It was you and Dad and home, and I'm the one who destroyed it all. She looked at me with raw, genuine pain. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I needed you to know I finally see it. What I did. Who I became. I wanted to be cold. Wanted to turn my back the way she'd turned hers. But looking at my daughter, really seeing her for the first time in years, I saw not the polished philanthropist or the calculating inheritance hunter, but the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared. "There's something you need to see," I said finally. "Come inside." She followed me into the house, looking around at rooms she hadn't visited in years, with the eyes of someone seeing them for the first time. I went to the safe, retrieved one of the 3 envelopes, and handed it to her. "Your father wrote this for you. He hoped you'd come back. He hoped you'd prove him wrong." Melissa stared at the envelope like it might bite her. Her name in Richard's handwriting. She broke down again, clutching it to her chest. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "No." I agreed. "But he loved you anyway." She opened it with shaking hands and began to read. I left her alone in the living room and went to make tea, giving her privacy for this moment with her father's words. When I returned 20 minutes later, Melissa was curled on the sofa, the letter clutched in her hands, sobbing like her heart was breaking. Because it was. Melissa stayed for 3 hours that day. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? She'd read Richard's letter, and it had destroyed and rebuilt her simultaneously. When she finally left, she hugged me. A real hug, not the performance from before. She whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything." I didn't say, "I forgive you." I wasn't ready for that yet. But I said, "Thank you for coming." She left with her father's letter, and I wondered if I'd see her again. If this was genuine change or just another manipulation. 2 days later, she called. "Mom, can I come over? I want to help with whatever you need. Cleaning, organizing errands, anything. Why? Because Dad's letter said I need to earn my way back. Not with words, with actions. Her voice was steady, determined. And because I want to. Not for inheritance, I know that's gone. Just because I want to be someone you're not ashamed of. She came every Tuesday and Thursday after that. At first, I gave her simple tasks, organizing the garage, sorting Richard's clothes for donation, helping me pack up the house. She never complained, never acted like the work was beneath her. 1 week became 2, then a month. In week 5, Ethan showed up. I was in the garden when I heard his voice. "Mom." I turned. Ethan looked diminished. Not just thinner, though he was, but smaller somehow, like he'd been physically compressed by shame. "Melissa told me you were here," he said. "She said you gave her Dad's letter. Did he write one for me?" "Yes." "May I have it?" I studied him. "Why should I give it to you?" "Because—" He swallowed hard. "Because I want to know what he thought. What he wanted me to know. Even if it destroys me, I need to hear it." I went inside, retrieved the second envelope, and handed it to him. Ethan held it like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Mom, before I read this, I need to say something." His voice broke. "You were right. At the funeral, at the trial, all of it. I chose money over Dad. I convinced myself it was okay because business comes first and Dad would understand. But he didn't. And he shouldn't have." He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I told myself for 3 months that you manipulated him, that the will was invalid, that we deserved that money. But watching Melissa work to earn your forgiveness made me realize we didn't deserve anything. We abandoned you. We abandoned Dad. And when he called us out on it, I tried to make you the villain so I wouldn't have to face what I'd become. Why are you here, Ethan? Because I want to be someone Dad wouldn't be ashamed of. I know it's too late to change what happened, but maybe it's not too late to change who I am." He sat on the porch steps and read Richard's letter right there while I worked in the garden. I heard him gasp, heard him cry, heard him whisper, "God, Dad, I'm so sorry." And when he finished, he folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he just sat there staring at nothing, processing. Finally, Dad was right. About everything. I built an empire and demolished a family. And the empire meant nothing in the end. "What are you going to do about it?" I asked. "I don't know, but I'd like to start by asking, can I help? Like Melissa's doing, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to be useful." 6 weeks after that, Sophie arrived. She came quietly, nervously, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask, but Melissa and Ethan said you gave them Dad's letters. Is there one for me?" "Yes." "I don't know if I want to read it," she admitted. "I'm scared of what it says." "You should be," I said gently, "but not reading it won't change what it says." I gave her the third envelope. Sophie's letter was shorter than her siblings, but no less powerful. She read it sitting on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, tears streaming silently down her face. When she finished, she looked up at me. "He said I still have a heart, but I let you suffer alone. I was a coward." "Yes," I agreed. "You were. But he also said not to let their redemption happen without me. That family is about helping each other stand up." She stood wiping her face. "I want to help, however I can." So they came, all 3 of them, Tuesdays and Thursdays, then every day. They didn't move back in, that would have been too much too soon. But they came to help pack up the house, to sort through 42 years of accumulated life, to be present in a way they hadn't been in a decade. We didn't talk about the trial, or the money, or the past. We talked about Dad's terrible jokes, about memories they'd forgotten, about recipes and photo albums, and the minutiae of daily life. Slowly, something like a family began to reform. Not the same as before. This was built on rubble, on the ruins of what we'd been. But maybe that was better. Maybe things built from destruction are stronger than things that were never tested. One evening, after they'd all gone home, I sat with Richard's portrait, the watercolor I'd been working on for months, finally finished. They came back, I told the painting. Not the way they left, but they came back. Was this your plan all along? The paint Richard just smiled his enigmatic smile. That night my phone rang. Thomas Harlan. Mrs. Carter, there's one more thing. Richard left a final instruction I was told to execute only under very specific circumstances. My heart raced. What circumstances? When all 3 children returned to you, not for money, for you. His voice was warm. Congratulations, Evelyn. You've passed his final test. They've passed it too. What's the instruction? Come to my office. There's something you need to see. Harlan's midnight office glowed with city lights. He handed me an envelope marked, "For Evelyn, when they come home." Richard's letter explained everything. The $47 million was bait, a test to show my children who they'd become. He'd known they'd lose everything, counted on it. Only when we have nothing do we realize what actually matters. He wanted me to see myself clearly too, not just as mom, but as Evelyn, artist, the woman who'd disappeared. The real inheritance isn't money, he wrote. It's the family you rebuilt. You saved our children's souls. That's worth more than any fortune. Inside a wooden box, my lost wedding ring, his pocket watch engraved, "For the time we didn't get, and the love that never ends," an old family photo, a dried rose from our first date. 2 weeks later, we gathered to watch Richard's final video. He appeared on screen looking directly at us. This wasn't about money, it was about waking you up. He addressed each child by name, calling out their failures with brutal honesty. Melissa built a facade of compassion while forgetting real love. Ethan succeeded at everything except what mattered. Sophie had heart, but fear silenced her. "You made your mother disappear," he said. "But she came back. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known." His final wish: take care of her. Not out of guilt, but because she deserves to be seen, live lives that matter. After the video ended, Sophie revealed their assignment work at the Richard Carter home for 1 year. Real work. Learn what it means to be forgotten and what it takes to make someone feel seen. "The home opens next month," I said, 6 a.m. sharp. They nodded, and I believed them. Opening day arrived in spring. I reached the home at 5:45 a.m., but my children were already there in volunteer shirts, nervous and determined. They received real assignments: Melissa in food service, Ethan in maintenance, Sophie in companion care. No special treatment, just labor. Week 2, Melissa met Mrs. Dorothy Dawson, 81, who sat by the window every morning waiting for children who never came. "They send checks," she said sadly. "I'd trade it all for one hug." They hadn't visited in 4 years. Melissa cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes, seeing her own mother's alternate future. Ethan learned from Mr. Harold Chen, a retired engineer whose CFO son hadn't called in 8 months. Teaching Ethan basic plumbing. Mr. Chen wondered aloud if he'd raised his son right too much money, not enough character. Sophie interviewed residents with extraordinary stories. Civil rights activists, jazz musicians, shelter founders, all forgotten by their children. She started the Invisible Generation podcast. It went viral. Families called asking to reconnect. 3 months in, exhausted on the back steps, they realized the truth. "Mrs. Dawson's kids are us," Ethan said. "We didn't even send checks," Melissa whispered. "We sent nothing." Through the window, they watched me helping residents fully present more alive than I'd been in my own home. "She doesn't need us anymore," Sophie said. "Maybe she never should have." But they kept coming. 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Not performing redemption, living it. 11 months later, Christmas Eve. I expected to spend it alone in my small house near the home. At 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. All 3 children stood in the snow. Melissa held a lumpy homemade cake. Ethan carried a wrapped box. Sophie held red tulips, my favorite flower. "We missed your birthday," Melissa said. "And the year before. We're here now." We lit 68 candles plus 1 for Richard. The cake was awful. Melissa forgot sugar, but we ate it laughing. Ethan's gift, a leather journal for my art, inscribed, "For Evelyn Marie Thompson, artist, mother, the strongest person I know." Sophie's gift, a framed photo of us at the home, Richard's portrait visible behind us. "Past and present," she said. We talked for hours about memories. Early years before everything broke. They slept in my guest rooms. Melissa, FaceTiming Mrs. Dawson. Ethan, designing home expansions. Sophie, editing her podcast. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. At midnight, Harlan called. "Richard left one final instruction for when your children came home for Christmas." Christmas morning, Harlan handed me the final envelope, "For Evelyn when love wins." Richard's letter. They came home. Not for money, but for love. I knew they'd lose everything I planned for it. Only by losing what they thought mattered could they discover what actually does. He wanted them to see who they'd become with money, selfish, cruel, and who they could become without it. Humble, loving. Most importantly, I wanted you to see yourself. Not as someone's mother, but as Evelyn. The woman who painted, who danced in rain, who disappeared so gradually, even she didn't notice. You saved our children's souls. You gave them character. That's the real inheritance, not money, but who they become because of what you taught them. The greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you leave behind. Inside the box, my ring, his watch, our beach photo, the dried rose. One note. These are the things that matter: time, love, memory, legacy. The home's 1-year anniversary. 200 people on the lawn. I stood at the podium, holding Richard's watch. "Richard didn't leave me money," I told the crowd. "He left me a mission: ensure no one feels invisible the way I did." My children stood in front, Melissa directing community outreach, Ethan coordinating volunteers, Sophie giving voice to the forgotten. They made terrible mistakes, but they made harder choices. Choices requiring humility and genuine change. That's real inheritance, becoming better than you were. Later, we stood before Richard's portrait. Its plaque read Richard James Carter, 1952-2025, who taught us that the greatest inheritance is love that transforms. Sophie ran up crying. "Mrs. Dawson's son flew in from Boston. He heard my podcast and realized what he'd been doing. They're reuniting right now." Through the window, Dorothy embraced her son for the first time in 4 years. "This is what Dad wanted," Melissa said. "Transformation, not revenge." That evening, I painted in my garden 4 figures linked together, surrounded by light. A family broken and rebuilt. As fireflies danced, I felt Richard's presence and heard his voice. "You were never invisible to me, Evelyn. Never." I whispered to the dusk. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for teaching our children that the greatest inheritance isn't what you have in the bank." The painting glowed in fading light. It's who shows up when you have nothing left.